Welcome everyone to Keeping in Tune with the Needs of Your Students. My name is Leanne Velasco. I'm the Director of Music Therapy here at Levine, and hopefully today we'll give you just one step into the world of teaching students with different learning abilities, and hopefully we'll find some little handy tips and tricks that you can implement immediately into your lesson space in order to help those kids who might need just a slightly different learning approach. Most of what we'll talk about today is more in reference to individual lessons, but some of the concepts can be applied to group sessions as well. Hopefully we'll have a more specific training about that in the future too. So we're going to go through some of the signs of learning differences that you might see in your lesson space. It's not an exhaustive list, but just some things that you might see. Then we're going to talk about how to adapt and modify the physical environment of the lesson space, how to change the structure of the lesson to more meet the needs of your students, how material is presented to students, how to communicate concerns with parents, how to access our music therapy team's support here at Levine, and then time for discussion and brainstorming. And if you have questions as we go, please feel free to jump in. But we'll start with different signs of learning differences in the music lesson space. How many of you have students who you know have a particular special needs diagnosis in your studios? How many of you suspect that you have someone in addition, right? So a lot of times parents will not disclose information because we are a community music school and the access to music education should be the same for everyone, and some parents feel that the stigma of a special needs diagnosis might follow them into the music lesson space and that we might approach things differently. So sometimes that information isn't shared. It's not our job, not even in our department, to diagnose or to suggest a diagnosis. So we focus more on what we're observing and the behaviors and the needs that are presented as it relates to their instruction specifically. So the first thing is a lot of students with learning differences and different learning needs diagnoses is auditory processing information. So students hear what you're telling them, but then their brains don't know what to do with it or take a long time to sort out the information and provide a response. Students with dyslexia, in particular, have an issue with decoding musical symbols. We know that music is a very abstract language to begin with, and using symbols, even something like the stems of a note, there might be difficulty in discriminating whether it goes up or down, which of course can be very problematic when it comes to theory and learning how to read music. Same thing with symbols like sharps, flats, naturals. It might take some of our students longer to really identify what that particularly means. I'm sure we all have students who have general attention issues. We might see the daydreamers, the person who might pay attention for 5 minutes and then you lose them for a while. On the other end of things, we might see kids who are unable to sit still, or the ones who fidget or are always moving or seem very just uncomfortable in their own skins. We also might see those students who clearly have not practiced, and not in a defiant way, just haven't done it, or come in with things in such disarray that they're very disorganized. Even if you try to help them sort things out, they're just a bit all over the place. And sometimes that could be associated with ADHD, not always. But something else we might see is anxiety in a lot of our students, whether it's related to performance and recitals and juries and all that fun stuff that we do, or just in general in the relationship in the lesson. So kids who are afraid to make a mistake, or kids who are afraid to try something new and immediately are resistant because it's too hard, or who are nervous about sight reading because they don't want to fail and they don't want to disappoint you as their teacher. So some of that can be rooted in more insecurity and lack of confidence and the willingness to, or the desire to just be accepted and supported by someone who they look up to. So it may manifest in a lot of different ways. Earlier this week, someone also brought up that we may also see students, adults, with vision issues. So whether they have astigmatism or whether they are starting to lose their vision or have corrective lenses, that's also an issue that could impact music reading. Sometimes bifocal lenses are not conducive to looking up at sheet music and down to hands. So there are different things that we can do. Are there things that are missing from this list that you see in your lessons that you think there might be some kind of red flag, or I need to sort of adjust what I'm doing in my lessons? No? All right.
You did mention like vision, like
Yes.
distance between the. Okay.
Right. So the question was if we did address the vision concept. And yes, we had one teacher who talked about having students who were adult students with vision issues who were having trouble getting lenses that were still fitting their everyday needs, but also the music reading needs. And so she's done a lot of work with the ophthalmologists of the students and measuring the space between where they sit and where the music is so that the student can take it to the ophthalmologist and say, I need lenses that help me see this distance and I need them to be bigger instead of the line between the different lenses within the glass, because that transition can be difficult as well. So she's found great success with that. And so that's new to me, and I love that. So something to keep in mind if it seems like your students are having trouble seeing what they're doing, it really could be a physical vision issue. So moving on to ways to adapt the actual lesson environment. There are a lot of things that we have in our lesson spaces that could be distracting to our students that we might not even think about or that might not be a distraction to us. The first thing is lighting. Fluorescent lights are in all of our studio spaces at all of our campuses. They have a high-pitched hum that most of us don't hear and most of us don't notice. But kids with different sensory needs who are hypersensitive to sounds hear it, and it's distracting. So when possible, we incorporate lamps, whether they're floor lamps or table lamps on the top of the piano, to help turn off the fluorescent lights and increase the softer and warmer light in the room without that buzzing. Does anyone here hear the fluorescent lights? We can't hear it now, but there are also some people who I've heard recently are allergic to fluorescent lights. So it's fascinating. I've never heard of that, but I can imagine that's very impacting in everyday life because they seem to be everywhere. Mirrors, yes?
Sorry, what are the reactions to a fluorescent light allergy?
So the question was, what are the reactions to a fluorescent light allergy? And I'm not sure. I just heard it this week, actually. I would imagine it would just be overly sensitive, maybe increasing migraines, but that's just speculation on my part. Some people who are very sensitive when you are first out in bright sunlight and that bright light, maybe it's a similar situation. Mirrors. We have a lot of studios with mirrors, and we have a lot of instruments and lessons that we use the mirrors a lot, so they're very important. But for some of our students, the mirrors become an instant source of distraction because we want to see ourselves, we want to see what different shapes we can make in the mirror, and we're always peeking rather than focusing on the lesson. So if it becomes a distraction, set up the room so that the student's back is facing from the mirror, or cover it up. Sometimes we have had to cover up mirrors because even with a back facing, we've still had students who tend to move so that they know where the mirror is as well. The same goes for windows. We love to have windows open, but sometimes, especially when it gets warmer and we have them open and we hear sirens and we have car horns and we have kids outside, it becomes an easy source of distraction out the window. So if possible and you notice that a student is tending to glance to the windows, shut the blinds, or keep the windows open and shut the blinds so you can still get the air into the room. Sounds. We all know that our phone notifications and our laptop notifications need to be turned off, but even the vibrating the notifications might be heard by students who are more sensitive and have more auditory sensitivity. We can't control, obviously, what goes on outside of our lesson space. So if there are just small things that we can do inside the space to make it more conducive to learning, then it's worth a shot. The other thing is student positioning. So some of our students can benefit from standing up for a little bit. So if you typically sit for your lessons, if there's something they can do to stand up and play, even at piano, it just gives them a different space to be in with their bodies and helps them mix things up a little bit and not get stuck in their position in a chair. Same thing goes the other way. If you stand a lot, if there's something they can do sitting to change the level, that's helpful. Yeah.
What do you do when you have parents sitting in the room and the whole time they're on their phone and their phone is, got notifications and it's a little awkward sometimes. It's one thing I have no hesitation saying to a parent, to a child, or, you know, please shut your phone off during the lesson. I'm a little hesitant to say to a parent. So I run into that, and you know, it dings when a notification comes in. I'm thinking that's during your child's lesson, but I haven't said anything because I'm not comfortable with it.
So the question is how to address parents who have their cell phones in the lesson space with notifications dinging, which I'm sure is becoming even more common in a lot of studios, and whether or not it's something that we should be addressing with parents. And I think that there's absolutely a way that that could almost be a blanket notification for all families if it's a sign to put on the door.
No cell phones.
Exactly, or please turn your cell phones to silent. Yeah, and that way it's not specifically for that parent, but a general studio rule. It may be helpful for our campuses to do, because I think even when the sound is on and you hear the click, 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 click of texting, that's distracting too. It's not as loud, but I think that parents should absolutely, they might not even notice, but it definitely is distracting for sure. And not only to the students, but to faculty too, which disrupts the flow of the lessons. But great question. Any other thoughts about the space? All right. So talking about how the lesson flows so that we can increase attention and motivation in some of our students. A lot of our students who have different learning needs really benefit from structure and from predictability. So that comes with routines. And I know that a lot of times our lessons take on the same format each week, which is fantastic and what a lot of our students crave. And because when we are comfortable in routines, then there's more of a willingness to be flexible with new things as well. So something that can be beneficial is to add the support of a schedule so that a student can see exactly what the expectations are for that particular lesson. There may be students who have anxiety about not knowing exactly what you're going to ask them to do that day, or not knowing how many songs they're going to have to play, or who might become focused on the clock, which is another actual sound bite that I missed on the last slide about ticking clocks in our classrooms, and we might have to get them out because unless we're playing at 60 beats a minute, it might become very distracting for our students who aren't able to block that out and focus on what you're doing. But schedules may be very helpful for students, and sometimes that's just taking a piece of paper and writing down a few things that you're going to do the session plan for the lesson and having students cross it off or having students check a box. I know I really like checking off a to-do list, and for some of our students it's a nice physical and concrete way to say, okay, I got through that, I'm done, I'm on to the next thing. And it puts out the expectations from the beginning. Sometimes we have the mini whiteboards, which are also helpful because then you could erase them or you could change it more than going through reams of paper, so that's something that's an option. Some of our students benefit from additional visual supports, so adding pictures to schedules. And if you have a student that you feel like might benefit from something like that, let us know, and we're happy to help make those kind of visual schedules. We found that we don't have to be really specific about schedules. We don't have to list every exercise that we're going to do, but just a general flow of the session. We might have a couple different things or categories of things that we'll work through so that they know the general routine of the session. Organizational strategies. If you see a student who's having trouble keeping track of practicing, maybe explore with them what would be an attainable goal, what would be realistic for them from their perspective, because what we might find is beneficial may not match with what they think is realistic, and it may create just a shutdown response. And so maybe work with your student on goal setting for themselves so that they're holding themselves accountable for their own schedule. And the same thing goes with organizational strategies for their materials and how things are kept for them to make it easily accessible at home. What I might find as a good organizational strategy might not match with a student, so having their input on that as well would be helpful so that everyone's on the same page and they feel like they're having a big hand in the process too, and not just being told how to manage expectations throughout the week as well. Breaking up tasks that are hard with ones that are motivating throughout the lesson. So if there's a piece that or an exercise that your student is really struggling with, follow it up with something that they've mastered or that they enjoy working on, or that just gives them a bit of a break, because then it gives them a little light at the end of the tunnel, reboosts their confidence and their self-esteem so that they're ready to tackle something else. So if at all possible, try to do things like that. And get to know your students' favorite songs and preferences outside of what you're working on, so that if you need to have that extra motivator at the end of a session or lesson, you can throw that in at the end as something totally different. And you paying attention to their preferences will also boost their confidence and their feelings of, you're listening to me outside of me listening to you in the lesson space. So you're hearing what I like and you're incorporating that into our work together. Does anyone have any questions? No? All right. So another thing that I'm sure that we all do, but something to keep in mind, offer choices whenever possible. It may seem very simple. Do you want me to turn the big light on or the lamp on? Do you want to work on this first or this first? A lot of our students, especially those who have learning differences, are told what to do from the moment they wake up to the moment they come to their lesson. And so having a little bit of ownership whenever possible is huge in boosting their confidence and their feeling of involvement in things as they're moving along. Some of our students may benefit from 30-second movement breaks, whether that's halfway through the lesson, whether that's at the beginning of the lesson, to help refocus and reorganize their bodies and their brains. Something that's important to note is that crossing our midlines with our bodies is very important, and some of our students don't know how to do that, which impedes development beyond that. So this is a very important skill. So to begin sessions, it's nice to do some kind of movement that helps them cross their midline to help make connections in their brain and get things firing and get things ready. So it could be a wiggle game, it could be the hokey pokey, it could be some kind of patty cake, just something that gets their bodies moving. Adding rhythm helps to organize our brains and makes everything work better together. So if there are rhythm games that you can play, that's always helpful as well. And we'll also pull some different movement breaks and brain breaks that we've heard through the week and that we also use, and include that in a packet once we've finished all of these workshops, so that you all have some ideas ready to go at your fingertips. And then breaking down larger tasks into smaller steps. So we may take for granted where we are with our proficiency in our instrument, and it's easy to forget how we learned things. And some of our students take something that may seem simple and it feels very monumental to them, and it feels very big of a task. So even thinking about something non-musical like washing your hands, if I said, how many steps do you think there are to a routine of washing your hands? What would you say if you had to write them out? Would you say 3? 3? Maybe wash, dry, or wash, soap, or rinse, wash, soap, rinse, dry? Or is it, I have to walk to the bathroom, I have to open the door, I have to turn the light on, I have to turn the sink on, I have to get my hands wet? So some of our students need to break things down that small. So if something seems like you're not getting somewhere, it might mean that you have to take it back even a step further than might seem comfortable. And I know some of our faculty this week have said that sometimes that's all it takes, is realizing, oh, I do have to go even backwards further than I thought this student needed. And it might not be in general, it might just be for that particular concept or that particular exercise that they just need another level taken away. Okay, any questions so far? Yeah.
I actually have, I think, a sort of related question about like using like rewards, because I do like stickers if they get like I get a sticker if they get 5 days of practice in the week, and then sometimes I'll give stickers if they like do a great job on their song or something like that. And I have one student who has fairly consistent behavior issues, and I have this person on like a behavior chart. And if it's like, I got it from my sister, who's actually a special ed teacher, but it's like the 3 different smileys. They have like a smiley face and then like a straight face and then a frowny face. And you do like green, yellow, red for each week. And right now, if this person gets like 5 out of 7 weeks with a green smiley, then he can pick a prize from my prize bag. So I don't know. I don't exactly know. So, and sometimes that is like too difficult. Like it's not always, that goal's not always realized. So I don't know about like using rewards. I don't know what's too big a reward really, or if like I need to adjust the behavior chart for how many weeks he needs to get a green smiley. I don't. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. So the question is implementing reward systems into lessons and having sticker charts for practices, and then having larger behavior charts for having good lessons, and having rewards for 5 out of 8, good 5 out of 7 good lessons with a green smiley instead of any other behavior. Have you worked with the student on what that means to have a green smiley, like what the expectations are?
Yeah, we put together a list.
Oh, okay.
So we did that when I first implemented this. We said these are the things that have to happen, and then the student has some method that I actually am not super clear on with the at home with the au pair and the mom.
Mm-hmm.
So I also have to like double check with the au pair that it was a green lesson, if that makes sense. So
right.
There's some rules going on that I don't know about, and even though I've prodded a little bit, it's a little bit sensitive, I think, so I haven't prodded too much.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't gotten exactly like what those parameters are, if that makes sense.
Right, so there is communication with home when possible, but that could definitely be a sensitive situation. And a lot of times when students benefit from those kind of reward charts, especially with behavior, not so much the practice chart, because I think that's very concrete. Did you meet your practice goal for the day? Yes or no. When you get into more of the complicated behavior charts over that long of a time, that's a long time to maintain that kind of behavior, and a pretty high percentage, right? 5 out of 7 sessions. Most of those students may come with a particular behavior strategy plan that works for them that might be similar, but it might mean having to adjust the time frame where, you know, if it's 2 out of 3, or if you notice that the student is struggling, mm-hmm. and in a period where 5 out of 7 isn't going to work, that might increase frustration with the student that I'm never going to get it. So if I'm already having 3 out of 7 lessons that I didn't get a smiley, I'm done for the reward. Mm-hmm. So why am I going to have a green smiley now? Because there's no reward in it for me. So maybe adjusting and either starting over or making it smaller, maybe 2 out of 3 to start. Because then once the student, the same goes with teaching concepts too, to start small so that they're successful. So if he can master 2 smileys out of 3 and get a reward, and do that a couple times to boost his own, oh, I can do this, I do get this reward, so that he physically experiences that, and it's not just an abstract, oh, maybe one day I'll get 5, and then you can increase. Oh, good.
So he's gotten a reward a couple times, but they also transition au pairs every year, so that's coming too. So I'm like trying to think ahead. It's always crazy, but.
So, and knowing things like that, knowing that there are transitions coming, or if something's different in the child's life, may mean that for that week, it's a, hey, today's a special day. If you get a green smiley today, we get something that may not be as big as something from the prize box, but it could just be an extra sticker or a stamp or something that is just acknowledging that I noticed that this might not be realistic today, so here's what I'm going to do instead. Okay. Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
Because you can scale it back to smaller chunks of time, and then increase after that is successful for a few times, and then move to 3 out of 5, and then 5 out of 7. Okay. And that way they're earning, and it seems more doable for them. Yes, yes, but great question, and thank you for implementing that in your lesson too. I know it's.
I have my sister as a resource, so it's super helpful.
And it's hard to bring those type of non-musical things and supports into the lesson, but it's important to keep in mind that if they're there in other settings, they're there for a reason, and they, if possible, it could be beneficial to us. We also have the benefit of a lot of kids with different diagnoses really love music. They really respond well to music. So sometimes even some of the students that we've worked with who have more behavior issues than other students do well in music, and we might not have to implement some of that to the extent that other settings might. So, so we are fortunate in that in some cases too. Let's see. Oh, so next is talking about how music is presented to our students, and some easy modifications that can happen if students are having trouble focusing on music on the page, maybe it's too small. So just enlarging music may help some of our students. Highlighting things, whether it's left hand, right hand, whether it's treble clef, bass clef, or if it's a particular rhythmic pattern that they're struggling with, to highlight it so that they know it's coming. Color coding notation might be an extra support that some students might need. Some of our students don't read music, but they match colors on the keyboard or they match letters. And then we color code the letters so that we can start fading things out so that eventually they can get to music reading. Some of our faculty in the past have had success with changing the color of the paper on which you print the music or have the music. Some of our students' white paper with black text is very glaring and it makes it hard to focus and see. So changing to blue paper might help, or light pink paper. Probably not highlighter yellow paper, but something that's just maybe the beige kind of ivory paper that's not as bright white paper. Sometimes looking at a page of music is overwhelming for a lot of our students because they're looking at what they already played, they're looking at what's coming next, and not focusing on what they're actually playing. So a very low-tech, very easy way to make a viewfinder type distraction minimizer is to just take a manila folder and cut it in as many chunks as you have staffs on a page, so that when you're working on the first line, you can open the first window, and then you can shut it so that we don't go backwards and start from the beginning every time, and open the second one. So that's a very easy way of minimizing distractions, because some of our students, the ones who want to race to the end, the ones who want to focus on something that they didn't get right, might need the physical support of blocking it off from their view. And a lot of our students have strong ears and have strong auditory propensities for music. So if you can, encourage oral learning as well when you can. And also use whole body learning to help learn different concepts. Don't be stuck to your instrument. If you can, use the bench to tap rhythms. Use the room to march tempos and rhythms. Use body percussion, clapping, tapping, snapping, just to get rhythms and concepts into our bodies and not just in our hands or in our hands. Let's see, and play large-scale movement games to help do different things too. If your student's having trouble learning the melodic contour of something, see if they can trace it on the board. See if they can move it with their arms instead of just on the page or just humming it. So incorporate non-musical movement as much as possible. Any questions? Yeah?
Could you expand a little bit more on the color coding notation? How would that work with different rhythms, for example, and different notes?
Sure. So the question was, how would color coding notation work with different rhythms and notes? Typically, we do color coding with notes. So we have, in a lot of our materials, things are color coded with C is red, D is orange, E is yellow, in the rainbow, like that. So then everything that we have matches. So we have red on the C on the piano, and then it matches the page. So we may have students that can just do the dots on the page. So if they're learning Twinkle Twinkle, above the words we'll have a red dot, and they play a red dot. Then we might change it to a red C so that they're matching but also seeing the letter C. Then we might put the note with the C that's red, and then take away the red. So it's just an extra visual support, but most of our things are color coded in that way. We don't typically color code rhythms, but that being said, you could always have a student look through a piece and highlight in orange all of the dotted 8th, 16th rhythms if that's something you're working on identifying. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes?
You had used in the past an example of you talked about the horizontal kind of the file folder, but you also had some suggestions for the kind of vertical, like reading vertically in a limited amount of space.
Yes, thank you. So the question was, how do we limit things vertically for viewing and not just horizontally? Because some of our students, even need further modification than just a whole line of music because their eyes might want to go backwards. And so one thing that can happen is taking something like an index card and moving it from left to right as the student is moving so that you're guiding where their eyes are going. We also had someone suggest that they have just the vertical treble clef, bass clef blocked out, and it's essentially down to a note at a time, reading left to right, or you could do a measure at a time, reading left to right. And so you could just do a box that you cut out of cardboard or something to move and block, or just use the index card to move. If you have something like this and you have it open, but then you have an index card that you're pushing along, then you have both supports at once. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so the other thing that's important to talk about is how we interact with students and how they get information verbally from us. And the first thing is to keep our language simple and eliminate extra language. So the way that we're talking now is way too much information for our students, and a lot of it will be lost. And so keep things short, and keeping phrases short doesn't mean that we're being curt, or that doesn't mean that we're being unpleasant with our students. It just means instead of saying, come on in, take a seat, get ready, here we go, we're gonna get started, we can just say, hi, sit down, that's it. It doesn't mean that we're not being nice. We're just eliminating things that might cloud up the processing time in our students' brains. Also, maintaining a neutral tone is important because some of our students with different diagnoses have difficulty interpreting sarcasm and humor and are very literal thinkers. So if we use a metaphor, or if we use some cliche or some phrase that we all know what it means, our students might not, because they just take the words as they come and might be very confused and might have a very different meaning of what we're saying. Using statements versus questions. I'm sure we can all get into the rut of saying, can you do this? And your student says, no. So eliminate that altogether and take out the question and just rephrase into a statement so that you're giving them the expectation and the direction rather than inviting them to say no. And be mindful of your nonverbal cues too. Our students can be very sensitive to even the slightest eyebrow raise, especially ones who might be insecure. And if they play something wrong and you sort of make a little thing, they notice. So try to maintain neutral affect as well. And something that's important to know is to allow for increased response time. Some of our students, you might ask a question and there's crickets. And then an uncomfortable amount of time later, you might get an answer. The important thing to know is a lot of our students who have different learning needs have different response times and different processing times. So if you interrupt that cycle of listening, processing the information, and spitting out a response, that student has to start that over in their brains. So if we don't give the time and we ask the question again, we have to wait again. So it's uncomfortable for us, for some students, but I've had students who've had 30 seconds. You have to wait for a response, which takes a long time and is more uncomfortable for us than it is for them. Did you have a question?
I did actually. Actually, one you answered. I liked that you said don't repeat the question, because I feel like sometimes I wait for the response, but then I repeat the question, which I didn't realize was like interrupting that thought process. Parents have a really hard time with this. I teach Suzuki lessons where parents are in the lesson with the students, and I think there's a desire for the kid to like seem super smart and like on top of it. And I have a few parents where I have actually like pulled them aside and said, it's okay, it's like, I teach like 4.5-year-olds how to play the flute, and it's like they don't have to answer me right away. And I found that it's really difficult for parents who want to present their kids as being really smart and all this stuff to like not try to prod them into giving an answer sooner. So I don't know what to do, especially after you've already like pulled them aside.
So the question was, how do we address parents who are in the lesson who are interrupting that processing time and are prompting their students because they want their students to do well and they want to put on their best abilities in the lesson, and there are times that we have to pull aside parents and sort of address that directly. We've also tried to gently, in the moment, just kind of give a nonverbal wait. Sometimes nonverbal cues are important, and we're not being dismissive of the parent, but it might even be helpful to just say something like, this is a new concept, so we're working through this at our pace, or making some kind of statement that's indicative of giving that space a little bit, that's more about the topic and not about the parent behavior, if that makes sense, so that the parent doesn't feel like you're sort of reprimanding them in the lesson either. But I'll also think more on that, because that's a great, I know a lot of our students have their parents in the sessions too, and they continually over prompt their students, which then doesn't allow for the student to independently engage, which is important. And the, oh yes.
Is there like an age at which you think the parent should not be here anymore?
So the
Do you have opinions on that?
Like high school.
Yeah. Well, I have a high school student who's a parent,
I do too, yeah.
and I don't know how to break it to them because they're so used to doing it. And they take notes, and they're very involved, and they're practicing, and when they can't come, it's actually great. I love it. Because then they don't interfere, and the kid doesn't like look to the parent like, what do you think? Well, they're not the teacher. Like, what do you think, Dad?
So the question is, how old is too old to have a parent in the lesson, even if the parents are well-meaning in terms of taking notes so that they can help with practice at home? I think that perhaps it's definitely student-specific, of course, but we see that as well, where the student performs differently with the parent in the room and without. And some of our parents are more anxious about leaving their student to potentially falter in the lesson without their help. So it may be nice to suggest kind of a meeting halfway, like, let's start the lesson with just us, and we'll bring you in at the end to show you what we've worked on today so that you know what to practice, or something, let's try it this way, which is a little bit more difficult when we're talking with parents rather than the student. Or maybe it's a conversation with the student asking, do you want to try to have just mom or not mom in the lesson, or something like that. But I think that the age cutoff really depends. It's interesting that a high school student would have a parent who's on the practicing to that level of taking notes. Do you think the student needs that support? No.
But it's one of these things where it's, I think they would get very offended. They feel like they're very helpful.
So the concern is offending parents because they feel like they're actually being helpful to their student. Is there a way to maybe suggest recording the lesson so that the parent could? It's definitely a tricky situation, because then it becomes a matter of how to present things so that it's not offensive, but so that it allows the student to be more successful. Is the student going to be auditioning for college in music, or?
Eventually, but not yet.
Not yet, okay. Because that might be a good opportunity for them to prepare something independently and then present it to parents as, you know, what they've been working on in the lesson. Or does anyone else have suggestions for this? I know sometimes we see this even with the young ones, where the students behave completely differently with the parents, or parents are in there and are well-meaning, but it's not necessarily serving the student well. Does any have any thoughts?
Have you asked the student? Like, is it
Well,
because the parents always
Right. It's hard to get the student along.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or it'd
So-
be interesting to get your students' thoughts on it, you know? What if you
Yeah.
presented it as like, oh, they've made so much progress, I think they're ready to now be independent, like as a positive thing,
Right.
like they're ready to take, be independent and take responsibility, and yeah, let's try this, like as an exciting new thing rather than
That's a good idea.
Mhm.
thanks, but no thanks.
So there was a suggestion to turn it around on that the student has made so much progress, and maybe this will be a good opportunity as a stepping stone for the student, that let's see how well they can do because they've been making so much progress. That's a great idea.
The
Thank you.
student likes that the parents take notes.
Oh.
And, but if the parent's not there, the person is very bright, you know, perfectly capable of remembering. Like, they don't really forget what they absorb most of it.
Any other thoughts on that? it's a tricky situation. So I'll continue to think about that too, because I think it's something that is definitely can benefit a lot of our faculty too, because I'm sure this pops up a lot. All right, so when talking with our students too, it's important to use a lot of positive reinforcement, and a lot of our students require different forms of positive reinforcement. So some of our kids love high fives, some of our kids love thumbs up that are just, if they're too cool for the high fives, just a little thumbs up or just some kind of acknowledgement of, someone said earlier this week that when a student gets something right, even taking the words out of it, they just go ding. And just to have something that's fun, that's different, that they respond well to. Little kids love the fist bump or some kind of positive reinforcement that doesn't interfere with the flow of the lesson. Be careful when you're doing verbal praise to students that you don't get stuck in a good job, great job, good work, great job, good job, great job, because that just eventually kind of falls on deaf ears because you're just hearing that general good work, and there's nothing, there's not a whole lot of depth behind it, and they're probably used to hearing those same phrases all day. So if you can, make your praise specific to what you're noticing that they did a good job on. So say, I really love the way you maintained that steady tempo. Especially if you know they're struggling with something. I really liked how clear your articulation was. I really appreciated how hard you've practiced this week because I can tell with the way you played that. Because those kinds of verbal praises will stick with the students longer than just a great work today. But those are important too, if that's all we can get in, but it's important to try to be as student specific as possible.
Yeah.
Yes?
So in a group setting, you want to praise the child who you know has done a good job, but then what do you do with the rest of the kids? Then what about me? How do you address that?
So the question was, in a group setting, how do you address positive praise for everyone? Because when you give to one, another student expects it. If you can catch the kids throughout the session so that at least most of the kids are touched with that praise once, so it's not always the same student or the only verbal praise that's given was one time to that one student, then they feel like they're also being included. Or if it's a student that's struggling and they see that another student gets a verbal praise, then they may shape up quickly, and as soon as you see that, then give that one a verbal praise too. And that's definitely something that would be great to address in like a follow-up chat too about more group-specific things, because some things have come up this week that would be really helpful for a round 2, but more specific for groups. But does that make sense? All right. Okay, so the last thing is communication with parents, and we've sort of touched on some of this already, but we all know that opening those lines of communication from the very beginning of the year or the first lesson is most important, because that way, if we establish that comfortable rapport with parents, if something comes up, it's not as uncomfortable to bring up. It might still be uncomfortable, but like we talked about before, we're not in a position to diagnose or suggest a diagnosis, or we can't recommend the student be tested for something because that's not our lens or our training. But instead, we can focus on actual behaviors or actual concrete things that are happening in the lesson. Try to take your opinions and reactions out of things as well, and how you feel about the situation, and make it very much about the actual event and not even about the student, so that you're not calling parents and saying, boy, John is really struggling and he's just being really bad. I just don't know what to do. That's very much targeted at the student and not, I'm noticing in our lessons that when we do this, his response is this, or he doesn't seem to be catching on to this concept, or I'm noticing this behavior. Do you see it at home? Or have you seen this before? How can I help make our lessons more productive, so that you're almost making yourself vulnerable to the parents, that you're looking for their support to help the student, and not that there's something wrong with your student, but I need to kind of change things up a little bit to help him more. How can I do that? Does that make sense? It's definitely not a comfortable conversation, but I think if it's approached in a gentle way and in a way that's also concrete about their musical learning and their lessons at Levine, then it's more productive because it's more constructive and concrete rather than about personality and general person skills, if that makes sense. Yeah? All right. Okay, so we do have music therapy happening at all 5 campuses here at Levine. We have a team of 5 music therapists and an intern right now. We are happy and would love to brainstorm ideas with you. If anything ever comes up, we're happy to help make materials, like I said, with schedules, or if you need any kind of distraction blockers or visual supports, please don't hesitate to let us know. Chances are we have something like it and can just print out a new one. Also, when we talked in faculty council, the general consensus was sometimes faculty might go to their chairs for suggestions first, and that's completely fine. If you want to contact us directly, the chairs are also fine with that. So sometimes just a quick email to set up a 10-minute phone call might be helpful to brainstorm ideas for a student. Sometimes we could also do an observation of the student if the parents consent to it, of course. But sometimes just chatting through things specifically for a student might just help get a different lens on the situation, and we might be able to suggest some strategies to try out before we would even need to do something like an observation. But we're happy to do that at any time, so please feel free to reach out anytime. We love to be involved in whatever we can in order to help. So, wrapping up, I encourage you to use as much creativity and your musicality as possible to think about creative ways to help students who might have different learning styles than the majority of your studio. Oftentimes it's just a little thing that might make a huge difference, and just being in tune with what your students individually need. These strategies aren't one size fits all. It's not going to work for every kid, but think about how you can infuse your musicality to make things sometimes more engaging for our students. Some kids really benefit from improvisation and from breaks where you can incorporate concepts that you're working on, but in a free play kind of way or in a different way that they might find interesting or might catch their learning style a little bit differently, but doesn't compromise the content that you're trying to teach. And thank you for being here and for being open to incorporating different things that will help your students in their success and their musical careers here at Levine. We're excited about this kind of collaboration, and that's all that I have, but I would love to open it up for questions or thoughts, or if you have found things that have worked for you that the rest of us might benefit from, I would love to hear them. Or if you think of things later, please let me know. So.
Yeah, so when you talk about attention issues, I was explaining to this one kid, I'm sure there's some of the parents on me, and then I was explaining it, she was beginning, and she said, after I finished explaining, she said, so, she obviously didn't take in anything I said. I said, oh, so what did you think? And then she said, oh, I just totally blanked out. And she didn't, so I had to, maybe I have to just say it in like a half a sentence, really fast, like just 2 words or something. Maybe I said too much, I don't know.
Right, and so the situation was presenting a new concept to a student, and at the end, when checking for comprehension, the student said they just blanked out. And it may be that. It may be that it was too much for them, so it might mean that that student might need more frequent check-ins. Like one thing that you're showing them and say, okay, did you get that? What does that look like? And check for the understanding and listening after each piece instead of at the end, if that makes sense. Or if it was just one piece.
It was just one really short thing. Maybe I have to make it like one word or something, I don't know. I have like 2 students like that. The other one is like, she's always looking around at the ceiling, the floor, and I'm like, I said, well, you either have to look at the music or you have to listen and try to remember. And I said, there's no other way to. So I said, can you try to focus on? And she just can't focus.
So there are situations in studios where students are looking all around the room and not able to focus on what's going on. Is there a way to turn the tables a bit, and if you're demonstrating something, do the intentional making a mistake to see if they're paying attention and catching on, so that it's more on the focus is on you and not on them learning the information, if that makes sense, or if possible to sit and wait until they're like, to wait for them to sort of refocus on you. Sometimes that someone earlier this week said that when they have a student like that too, sometimes that they'll take away what they're working on and just do some kind of silly back and forth type thing that seems unrelated just to get them paying attention more. They might need more breaks like that to refocus if they're burned out. And it's hard having students at the end of a day too, because I feel like their capacity for taking in new information is minimized as it is after a day of school, unfortunately. Does anybody have any suggestions for the kid who zones out?
I think I would also like suggestions for the kids.
So that can be something that we include in the packet too. I'll talk to the rest of my team too to see if there are little tricks. I know that on even a separate level, doing little check-ins that are totally unrelated to what's happening. So some of our kids benefit from those. Okay, touch your nose, touch your ears, eyes up, eyes down, and then okay, let's get ready to go. Just some strange little quirky thing that catches them off guard, but kind of re-centers things as well that might not be related to the content. But I will also think more on that too. So thank you.
Mentioned something about eye contact.
Mm-hmm.
Some kids have a hard time. It's painful
Mm-hmm.
to make eye contact, and you kind of like, okay, can you look at me, and indicated another part.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if this the child who can't, is it an eye contact thing? Is it just a lack of ability to focus, or is there some other kind of way to kind of bring their attention?
Sure. So the question was about eye contact and whether that might be an issue for the student rather than attention. I would guess it sounds more like attention though, if they're generally kind of zoning out and not so much. For some students on the autism spectrum, making direct eye contact is overstimulating. So forcing a student to be looking at you or expecting them to be looking in your eyes is not necessarily the best way to gauge attention or to force or reinforce attention. And so some people might indicate your chin or something like that to know that they're looking, but even just making sure that their bodies are turned. So taking into consideration other physical cues that show that they're paying attention. But if they're completely zoning out, I don't think that's necessarily an eye contact discomfort issue or sensory issue. It might just be really attention.
I tried talking to the parent too to see if there was, they didn't really answer me. Because I thought, well, maybe it's more than just my lesson,
Mm-hmm.
which I suspect it is, but they didn't really want to talk about it. So I don't know.
Sure.
If they don't tell you.
Right, and when parents don't disclose that information, it's really hard. Or when they seem uncomfortable talking about it, there's likely a reason. And we can't force that, of course, but that doesn't help in the lesson.
Doesn't help the child.
Right. Is it all lesson or just during particular things or?
No, it's like every lesson.
Okay, okay.
How long is the lesson? Half an hour.
Oh no.
It's a long half hour.
Right, sometimes it's
Just make
very
it
short.
short.
But when I have a couple of those in a row, like,
Oh yeah, I know.
Oh, yeah.
They're always like grouped together, right?
Right.
like 3 in a row, it's like,
Yeah.
oh no.
Yeah. Always on the same date. I actually have a question about because I know that like lots of students have like transitions where they're trying to figure out like medication that works. So I had like the specific example I'm thinking of was a student that I unfortunately did end up quitting, and it made me really sad because I thought she was a great player and I really liked working with her. And she was going through, and I don't know the background, but she seemed like really attentive in lessons, was having like a great time. We were making a lot of progress, and then like all of a sudden it just switched, and she was like zombie person. And and I know that like when they're transitioning, and I'm sure it was like necessary. I didn't see anything in the lesson that to me indicated there might be some kind of problem, but I know that I don't have the whole story, so I'm sure that they were just trying to figure whatever out for what was happening that I didn't know about. But seriously, it was like all of a sudden I was getting a zombie student in my lesson, and I think they were trying to adjust the medication and trying to figure it out. But in that transition, like she just stopped enjoying flute, and like it was, and I don't know if like I was still treating her like I had before when I had noticed that she had been like there'd been more spark in the lesson, if that makes sense. And trying to just get her to like she got all of a sudden nervous to like make a mistake on her scales, or like I have my students sing a lot, so I had and she all of a sudden was like not comfortable singing in her lesson, like she wouldn't sing, which is fine, and I just said, okay, we won't sing, that's okay. But like there were really dramatic changes that I noticed after the student went on medication, and I lost her in the transition, and I don't know what to do when you see those dramatic behavior changes happening, because I know sometimes it's a process and you want to be sensitive to that, but how do we keep them going in that transition, especially when they lose progress during that time period.
Right. So the issue is when students are going through medication transitions or changes, there can sometimes be abrupt changes in behavior and just engagement in general and personality sometimes. And I think that it's hard to work through that because it is such an external variable that we have no control over, and we don't know what's going on with their chemical balances in their brain, and so it's hard to anticipate what their needs are going to be, especially if it's inconsistent and completely out of character. I think that that's when more parent communication is important, because they're likely seeing it at home too, and maybe they've found something that's helped get over that hump. I think also for some of that, it's on our side to manage our expectations during that period, and so thank you for being aware of that too, and knowing that she's going through a lot at that point, because managing our expectations will hopefully decrease our own frustrations in the lesson because we're not making progress, and knowing, okay, in our work we do a lot with something called the ISO principle, so we're meeting a student where they are in that moment. And so if where she is on that day is not being able to play her scales, then maybe maybe you listen to scales, or maybe you take that element out or change it in a way that's different, and just adapt to where she needs to be, and being okay with that, and communicating that with parents that, this is what I'm seeing, and so I had to make these modifications for today, and hopefully we can get back to a place where we can get back on track, so that it's not giving up, but it's not expecting her to stay up here and kind of almost restarting a little bit, if that makes sense. And it may mean bringing out things that she already mastered to play again for fun, or to listen to a recording of it, or listening to two performers playing the same piece and seeing what she likes better, and just taking her almost to a different place, that it's not the focus on her for that time being.
There was, unfortunately with the student, there was a comparison issue too with like what other people, she had experienced a situation where students much younger than she was were playing the same pieces in the same time period, and so it was like, well, we try to like block that out, and like we know that like where I know I'm not concerned about that, and that like everyone's just on a different level. It really bothered her, and I think that and the fact that she wasn't at that time just was not making progress in her lessons. Like it just like I just she just
Right.
lost it.
Right.
I don't know. And maybe it's just that you can't control it all the time, but it was just too bad. It made me sad.
Sure. Well, and absolutely. So it is hard then when the students are comparing themselves to other students, and there's that internal pressure too that they're aware of, and the awareness that they're not performing at that level. And she was probably hyper aware of herself being very out of balance. And so maybe that's an opportunity to kind of think outside of the curriculum box, and think about if you know something about her, that she has a favorite movie, could you, just for the time being, try to learn one of those songs that none of the other students are playing, so that it's not, even if it's below her current level, it's at least something that's specifically for her, that I know that you really like this, so I brought this for you, just to change it up a little bit, that you're still trying to engage her, but just from a different perspective. Or even taking the music away and just doing some just improvisation or
Right.
some fun things that have nothing to do with what she's learning, to just to make her feel like you're still a person that's supporting her no matter what, too. Yeah, thank you. Anything else?
Thank you so much for your time, Leanne.
All right, thank you, everybody.